I'm a big fan of homeostasis. Do you know what that is?
Of course not.
Yeah. Homeostasis refers to a system's ability to regulate its internal environment and maintain a constant condition of properties like temperature or pH.
Worst bedtime story ever.
Yeah.
Sheldon is absolutely right. When it comes to humans, homeostasis is the body's way of maintaining constancy in the internal environment, even when the external environment becomes chaotic. This balance is primarily maintained through the extracellular fluid in which the cell swims. This concept was first proposed by Claude Bernard, who described the body as an internal environment that fights for constancy, and he named it as milieu intérieur. Fun fact about Claude Bernard, he wasn't just a scientist, but he was someone who was consumed by science, so much that he could ignore the pain and the suffering of the animal just to prove his biological point. In fact, his wife, who was an advocate for animal rights, eventually left him with the kids because he was found experimenting on their pet. Decades later, Walter Cannon coined the term homeostasis to describe how the body responds to stress and change. So, what parameters is the body trying to save? Parameters like blood volume, blood pressure, pH, temperature, ions and molecules like oxygen, hydrogen, potassium, calcium, glucose. Any small deviations in these parameters can be life-threatening. For example, a mild fluctuation of body temperature, 7 degrees above or below, can halt enzymatic activity, denature the proteins, and eventually cause cell death. A shift in the pH 0.5 below or above can be lethal. Potassium dropping by 1/3 can cause paralysis, increasing 2 to 3 times can cause cardiac arrest. Calcium dropping to less than half can cause tetanic contractions or seizures. Glucose cut down to half can cause mental irritability, convulsions, and confusion. Now let us see how the body maintains homeostasis. Before I explain it further, let us take the example of thermostat. So the thermostat has a sensor which detects a change in temperature inside the room and tries to maintain it to a room temperature. If there is a fluctuation, it immediately sends a signal to a control center which causes the effect by increasing or decreasing the temperature. Like some of the cars which has cruise control, and if it is turned on, can maintain the speed of the car without the need of accelerator. So the same way, it is constantly adjusting the speed when there is a slope or an uphill. So any sensor would only work if there is a stimulus and it can relay the response to the center. When the center responds to the stimulus relayed by the sensor, it immediately sends out another response to the effector and tries to restore the change in the variable. In these examples, you must have known the basic requirement of any homeostatic system is a sensor. But to describe it further, it requires a stimulus. Stimulus is nothing but a change in variable which is picked up by the sensor, and this information is given to the center. Now the center processes the information, sends a corrected signal to the effector, and the effector now restores back the variable from abnormal to normal. So when you discuss homeostasis, set point is the common word that comes across. It is nothing but a target that the body sets to maintain constancy. One thing about set point is it always has a range, and it tries to maintain the homeostatic mechanism in that particular range. For example, temperature around 37 degrees, blood pressure around 120 to 80 mm of Hg. Now, if there is a fluctuation in set point, if the variable goes above or below the set point, the body fights back to get it back to the normalcy, back to the set point. If there is a deviation, that can lead to pathology, a deviation from the normal physiological functions. Homeostasis operates by two mechanisms, feedback and feed-forward. The feedback system is again divided into negative and positive. Negative feedback is a change in variable that can cause a response which is opposite to that of the stimulus, whereas positive feedback is a change in variable that can cause the same response to that of the stimulus. Few of the common examples of negative feedback include regulation of blood pressure and regulation of hormone secretion. In case of regulation of hormone secretion, whenever there is an increase in the production of hormone, it goes back to the point where the hormone was synthesized and tries to inhibit that structure to prevent further secretion of hormone. So if the thyroid hormone is increasing in secretion, it goes back to the hypothalamus, to the anterior pituitary, and inhibits the further production of hormones that can increase the synthesis of thyroid. So this is a way of thyroid hormone to regulate its own secretion. Same way, in case of regulation of blood pressure, any stimulus that can trigger the rise of blood pressure is immediately detected by the baroreceptors which are situated inside the carotid sinus and the aortic sinus. These receptors immediately send out a response to the vasomotor center which corrects the changes of rise in blood pressure, and this information is relayed back to the blood vessels which causes vasodilation, and now the blood pressure is decreased, leading to return of normalcy. Gain of a system is nothing but how efficiently the system works to correct the error. For example, in a system without the sensor, without the homeostatic mechanism, the rise in blood pressure because of any stimuli, for example stress, can be as high as 175, the normal being 100. Now let us introduce a system with sensors, with control, with effectors that can regulate the blood pressure. And now that you introduce a stress, the response is just 125 mm of mercury, not 175. So that means the rise in blood pressure was plus 25 mm of mercury, but not plus 75. But it is still not back to the normal. It still means that the correction was not complete. It was not returned back to 100, but instead it was only bringing it down to 125 millimeters of mercury from 175. So that means it has reduced the blood pressure by minus 50, but the error remains of plus 25 mm of mercury. So now to give a perfect formula, a gain of a system is defined by the correction by error. The correction was minus 50 because the system has gotten down the blood pressure by 50 mm of mercury, but the error remained of 25 mm of mercury. So dividing these two, we get a gain of minus 2, which is disturbance that could increase or decrease the blood pressure to 1/2 if the control system were not present. The other example for negative feedback mechanism is decrease in the plasma volume could trigger the osmoreceptors in the hypothalamus that can cause the production of antidiuretic hormone, which eventually retains the volume of plasma that is filtered and prevents the formation of urine in order to conserve more and more volume inside the body. And it also triggers the thirst mechanism for which the organism tries to look for the sources of water and replenish the body demand for body fluids. Now coming back to the positive feedback mechanism where the change in variable would produce a response which is similar to that of the stimulus. Positive feedback is a vicious cycle because it could cause a derangement in the bodily functions if it was not controlled. For example, if a person is bleeding more than 2 liters of blood, the decrease in blood pressure following by the decrease of blood flow to the heart can cause decrease in the force of contraction. This decrease of force of contraction can reduce the cardiac output, which further decreases the blood pressure and it also decreases the blood flow, which eventually becomes a vicious loop that continues until the person is dead. But the positive feedback could also be advantageous to the body, and few of the examples include parturition reflex, luteinizing hormone surge before ovulation, coagulation cascade, Hodgkin's cycle, activation of digestion enzymes. Positive feedback is valuable in childbirth. As the contraction of uterus forces the child through the cervical opening or the dilatation of cervix activates the receptors, and this information is relayed to the hypothalamus, which causes the production of oxytocin that is sent back to the uterine muscles and cause powerful uterine muscle contractions. Other example is Hodgkin's cycle where the opening of one voltage gated sodium channel can trigger the opening of neighboring voltage gated sodium channels. And through this, the conduction of the nerve signal in the form of action potential is potentiated and it is sustainable throughout the journey along the length of axon. These examples along with the others can be elaborated further in a separate video to describe the role of positive feedback in their day-to-day functioning. But not all homeostatic mechanisms are reactive, some of them are anticipatory. When it comes to feed-forward mechanisms, there is little requirement of stimulus for the response to occur. The best example to describe feed-forward mechanism or anticipatory control or adaptive control is the role of cerebellum in servo mechanism. If you have watched the previous video on cerebellum, you can see the role of cerebellum in creating the sequence of movement without the requirement of a stimulus, because the time taken for the nerve signal to reach from the muscles of the locomotion to the cerebral cortex and relay it back to give the response would take a lot of time. Cerebellum saves the time by already creating the next sequence of movement and sending it through anticipation. So remember, homeostasis is always working to keep you alive whether you appear for an exam or you get the result. I'm Dr. Pranay from iPPaD Lectures. See you in the next video.